Hey, morning everybody. I have just a little assignment for you to relate to chapter 6. So this is just a National Geographic documentary. Show you, I also posted it under the assignments folder on D2L to make it easier to access that link. So this will be due on Wednesday. Good timing. So, like I said, you go right under class assignments here. You can see that, and then you can access that link to the video right there. So then you'll just watch the presentation and then just write in your answers below the questions. The questions are in order of the video, so with the video you can rewind and watch again as many times as you want to get those answers. So that'll be due on Wednesday. You can just turn in a hard copy or email, whatever is more convenient for you. As long as we're here, let's maybe go to number 2 now with the exam. So with the course outline, you can see where we're at with the schedule. Chapter 4 took just a little bit longer than anticipated, but we will get into chapter 6 today, and then you can see the exam coming up next Wednesday, February 16th. Morning, Ben. To help you prepare for that, there is a study guide posted here. And so if you open it up, it looks like this. So you'll have all of the, good morning, Tommy. You'll have all of the relevant class discussion as well as the applied reading. So the key points from each article that will be on the exam. So the articles that we go over this week, I'm going to hold over till exam 2. So just these 4 that you see on the study guide. And then chapter 4 material and chapter 6 material. So this would be a great way to focus your studies, and the exam will be very, very close to what you see here. As we get closer, morning tide, perhaps Wednesday or Monday, I'll spend some time answering questions, and maybe we can do just a little bit of a study session together here in class. So you'll have the opportunity to take some notes and get ready for the exam. Okay. So is there any questions on that part? Any questions at all? Morning, Levi. Okay. All right. So I guess who did I miss? So this will be due on Wednesday. So you can find the link on D2L in the assignments folder. Did I miss anybody else? Okay. Ben, I missed you. There you are. Okay. All right, so let's Let's go over Burley and Bishop. This is a nice article because it talks about transfer of training. So what does that concept mean to you, transfer of training? Transfer of training, what does that mean? Yes?
We learn things from you to on the field also.
Yeah. So the title of this class, Principles of Strength and Conditioning. So we do all these strength exercises and conditioning exercises with the intent that what we're doing will transfer. There'll be some type of correspondence between what we're doing as part of workouts and then what we can see in terms of benefits to performance. So other than just looking great in our uniform, we lift all those weights and we do all those sprints because there's a hope that it will make a positive transfer to what we're doing as part of our sport. So the exercises we choose are really, really important to correspond with the specificity principle. There was a nice quote right at the beginning of the article. So transfer of training refers to the degree of crossover. The degree of crossover from a training means to the desired outcome or task. So an example that was given, the extent to which a power clean impacts 5-meter sprint performance. So doing a power clean in the weight room would be intended to benefit how fast we can cover 5 meters, which is really important for sports. With sprinting, there are 3 parts. There's a start, there's an acceleration, and there's a maintenance of maximal speed. There's a lot of sports where an athlete doesn't have time to get up to maximal speed. Maximal speed requires about 50 meters to reach top speed. So what we're talking about most of the time is first step quickness, to make a quick start, to initiate motion. And then the second thing is being able to speed up rapidly. So acceleration. So a 5-meter sprint would involve lots of acceleration, being able to move our bodies quickly from one spot to another. Another important point, transfer ultimately determines the worth of training programs and their exercises in the context of improving athletic performance. The worth of training exercises. So what we do as part of training will determine how our body changes. And so we want the changes that our body makes, the adaptations that our body makes, to be specific to our sport. To look at what our sport requires and to make those changes that are beneficial for our sport. Let me ask you a question. Do all athletes require the same demands as part of their sport? No, obviously not. We have athletes in this room that have various requirements as part of their sport. We have throwers that have to produce maximal rate of force development and express very high rates of power over a fraction of a second. We have other athletes like Ali that have to maintain very high percentages of their aerobic capacity over long periods of time. So fatigue resistance is very important to her. We have soccer athletes, Ashley and Ty, if I don't leave anyone out, okay, that have an interesting mix of aerobic and anaerobic energy demands. What does anaerobic mean? What does that word mean? Yeah, So we're talking about high intensity activity in which we produce energy. What's the energy currency of the body? What does our body produce to provide the energy for muscle contraction? What's that molecule? Yeah, ATP is what our body produces to provide energy for physical activity. So Ashley and Ty have a good mix of aerobic and anaerobic type energy demands. So soccer is very challenging to train for because you have both parts of the continuum. You have a good amount of aerobic and a good amount of anaerobic. Other athletes like Ryder and Bryn, it's anaerobic. And athletes like Nolan, baseball athlete, it's more anaerobic. Basketball, Addison's sport, is very similar to soccer in that there's a lot of stop and go, but a good mix of aerobic and anaerobic demands. So the exercises that we do as part of a program will be different for each sport, especially as we get closer to the in-season time. Off-season is a little bit more generalized. So in talking about that and going from more general to specific, Brearley says, although training programs are likely more general in nature, during the early stages of training, as athlete preparation approaches competition time, transference to the target task becomes a priority. And therefore, training tasks commonly become increasingly similar. So trying to make what you do as part of a workout increasingly similar to the skill set that is required for sport, the movement pattern required for the sport. So there was a couple different philosophies presented as part of this article. I'd like to walk you through some of those. There's a lot of philosophy and a lot of subjective interpretation with specificity and transfer of training. I think there's some general principles, though, that we can all agree on in terms of how we move from perhaps a more general exercise to a more specific exercise. So these authors presented this figure with what they call the mixed methods approach. And I like that, a mixed methods approach. So looking at several different philosophies of specificity and combining them into one. So I think when we take multiple philosophies and take the best parts of each philosophy, I think the overall program becomes better. So we're not just sticking with one mindset, where we're accepting multiple lines of thought and reasoning. So basically what we've got on this end is traditional overload in a general sense. So we're working on improving general capacities. This would fit very well into the foundational characteristics that we talk about. So the capacity of strength, how do we define strength? Yeah, force output, one time. That's a general capacity. So we use different movements, squats and hip hinges, pushes, pulls, carries, all of these very general movement patterns. So you think about what we do and how we move. We squat, right? There's lots of different ways to squat. Lunges would fit under a kind of a squat, general movement pattern. Okay, we hip hinge. example of more of a hip hinge type exercise? What do you think? We squat, we hinge, what would, deadlift, yeah. How many different variations of deadlift can you think of? There's lots. So we're talking about general movement patterns. We squat in lots of different ways. We hip hinge in lots of different ways. We push in lots of different ways. Think of how many exercises involve pushing type motions. We do vertical pushes, we do horizontal pushes, we do pushes that are in between horizontal and vertical. Okay? And we pull, don't we? Yeah, we squat, we hip hinge, we push, we pull, and we carry. And how many do carries as part of a training program? Carry in various ways. So basically, it becomes pretty simple when we're talking about general movement patterns. And maybe there's a few more that I didn't mention, but those five, squat, hinge, push, pull, carry, and you pretty much covered everything throughout the body. So we can use those five general movement patterns to develop capacities like strength, like power, like localized endurance. And as we move in this direction, we kind of want those general movement patterns to be more specific to what we're doing as part of the sport. So maybe on this end of the continuum, we do some type of general pull or push. But as we get closer to in season, we maybe want to make that push or pull more specific to what an athlete is required to do as part of their sport. If we go over to this end, the coordinative overload approach, this is where the training task becomes very similar to what an athlete does as part of their sport. Let me give you some more examples. Okay. So this table, okay, from the article contrasts the two different approaches and provides some definitions. So this is traditional overload. Traditional overload. On this side is coordinative overload. So if we go back, traditional overload is kind of more in this area. Coordinative overload is over here. So if you put them all together, you've got this mixed methods approach, which I think is a pretty good idea. We go from general to more specific and close to the target task as we go through a training program. So I want you to take a moment and just read the characteristics of each side. So just take a moment and read each side. How do we define traditional overload versus how do we define coordinative overload? You recognize a lot of those words from chapter 4 in that table? A lot of the words from chapter 4 are showing up in there. So over here we have a little bit more general type development of capacity, strength capacity, power capacity, endurance capacity. And this is where we get highly specific over here. So this might be more off-season and preseason type stuff, whereas this might be more in-season type. So notice here, highly similar patterns of recruitment to the target task. what does that word recruitment mean? Where have you seen that word used before? Recruitment. In the context of what? Motor unit recruitment. So a similar pattern of motor unit recruitment to what we have as the target task. So we're getting increasingly specific. Let me share another table with you here. This kind of brings everything together. So here you have the traditional overload bias, and here you have the coordinative overload bias. Okay. I want you to notice that they're bringing in a lot of what this author, Bondarchuk's model. So general preparatory exercise down here. So as we go from general preparatory to specific preparatory to special development to the actual skill itself, the actual sports skill itself, I want you to notice the progression. We might be in the off season here, getting into preseason, and then gradually to in season. And so with each of these approaches, coordinative overload versus traditional overload, they provide examples of different exercises. So for example, in the traditional overload, the general category, they place like a single leg hip or hang snatch or clean or explosive hip thrusts or step ups. And so that would be traditional overload. That would be the general category. As we move over to traditional overload specific, okay, heavy sled towing, resisted hip flexion. So the skill that they were, anybody remember the skill that they were designing these tables based on from the article? So the article wrote these tables based on the 5-meter sprint. 5-meter sprint. So based on acceleration. So our ability to accelerate in sprinting. And so we go over further to more of a coordinative overload, which as you move in this direction, you're getting more specific. So single leg clean to step or switch step ups performed in series with stability challenge. So again, it's a little bit subjective, but do you see kind of a difference in going from this category, general, to specific, to coordinative overload? We're gradually getting more complex into a more sport-specific position. Rather than being lying down, we're in a more functional, ground-based type position. Let me give you just a couple of practical examples here. Okay. So traditional overload. How many have done this exercise? A lot of you better have your hands up because I've been there while you've done traditional overload in a general sense. So let's say we're working on sprinting ability. So a barbell hip thrust. Okay. From an external point of view, how does doing that with a barbell resemble a sprint? Not very well. Okay, so you see how it's a general exercise. So what is our hip doing though when we sprint? We get that rapid extension, right? So in a general sense, what we're working on is the ability to extend the hips. So there's certain facets of this exercise that are considered specific to sprinting. Okay. So what we're developing is the force and power capacity of the hip extensors. So these exercises are not specific in all aspects, but just in some aspects. And it turns out that there is a positive correlation between someone's ability to do this exercise, the amount of weight and the amount of force they put into the ground, and how well they can accelerate. So if you want to be faster, especially over short distances, you better be including hip thrust as part of your program. It's specific in some aspects, but not all aspects. Okay, so let's move along. So traditional overload, this would be a general exercise. Okay, traditional overload specific. Okay, so you see how we're moving from more of a general exercise towards the target task. So heavy sled towing. So we're starting to approximate the target task. We're taking all of that hip extensor force that we developed with hip thrusts, and we're moving along that continuum, learning to apply that hip thrust ability into the sprinting type pattern. Everybody with me? Making sense? Okay? All right, so let's go a little further. Okay? So now we're at that third level. So traditional overload general, traditional overload specific, and now we're at coordinative overload. So just hearing that word coordinated, what does that mean to you? Hearing that word coordinated or coordinative, what does that make you think of? Simple or complex in your mind? Yeah, it's a little more complex. So a physical therapist might say a phrase like proprioceptively enriched is a phrase that I've heard, proprioceptively enriched. So there's a lot of demands going on with the movement all at once. So as we get closer to the target task, the exercise becomes more advanced. It becomes more complex from a neurological standpoint. So here's one example. This was from the article. So this would be a single leg clean to a step up. How many have done something? I know you've probably all done cleans. How many of you have a single leg clean to a step up? That might be a good one for Allie for improving sprint technique. A single leg clean to a step up. So it's a little more complex. Here's another one. Switch step ups with a stability challenge. So we're going from A here, okay, which is kind of a little bit of an RDL variation. Everybody know what an RDL is? Romanian style deadlift, stiff-legged deadlift. So a single leg hip hinge, single leg hip hinge type pattern. Okay, we're loading the right leg, and then we're extending at the hips and bringing this leg up on that first box. And then we're climbing up these steps, which with a weight on your back, that creates a stability challenge. Because every time you pick up a leg, that's not stable, and you have to do what with your core? You have to activate to maintain your balance, to keep all of your joints in the proper alignment. So, is everybody with me? See how we go from something that's more general into something that's a little more complex and closer to the target task? Okay. So, let me give you another example. Maybe Bryn and Ryder could relate to this one. So, traditional overload general. So a bench press. That's okay, Ty. Bench press with accommodating resistance. Okay, I wish I had chains. I'd bring them. Accommodating resistance. What does that mean? Accommodating resistance. Where is the bench press the toughest? Right at your chest. So your musculoskeletal attachments have less leverage when the bar is right at your chest. And so it's more difficult to lift the weight there. So what accommodating resistance does, in this case, with the chain is as you bring the bar down to your chest, what happens to the weight of the chain? So those links are unloading onto the ground, so the load that you're lifting is less, right? So you're lifting less load where you have less leverage. And then as that weight is lifted back to the top, what do those links do? They rise off the ground and the load is heavier, right? So as you lift further off the ground, further away from your chest, you have more leverage. And so it accommodates your natural strength curve. Less load where you have less leverage, more load where you have greater leverage. So people oftentimes do the same thing with bands, but needless to say, this is a general type exercise. How close does that exercise look like a shot put? Okay, but is there some aspects of it, whether in the joint action or the force production or the power production? So we can look at that and say there's parts that are like the shot put. Okay, so let's move into something that's closer. Okay, so traditional overload specific. So just a clean, and we'll get into the labs where we'll be doing cleans. Okay? And I have lots of PVC pipes and things that we can use to learn how to do cleans with. Okay. So this is starting to look more like a shot put, not exactly, but closer. It's a higher velocity movement, high rate of force development. You're in a standing, ground-based type position. That's like a shot put. Okay. Moving on to the coordinative overload aspect. So landmine pull to press. So this looks closer to a shot put, right? It's more neurologically complex. So we missed the pull part in the picture. I could only find a picture of the press part. But what you're doing is with a single arm, you're here, and then what do you do, Bryn? Pull, and then what do I do? Switch, just like that. So it takes a lot of coordination. So pull, switching arms to a press. So is there any questions? You kind of, and again, there's a lot of subjective interpretation here about where an exercise would fit what category, but you kind of see the overall trend of how we group exercises. So generally speaking, as we get into in-season, we would want more exercises that would be closer to the target task is the idea. Okay. So any questions before we move on to chapter 6? All right, so as far as the other applied articles go, on Wednesday, I'm going to start going back through those. So you'll have an idea of what will be on the exam for that. So, okay. All right, so chapter 6, under consistent, and Jackie, so this will be due on Wednesday. You can find that on D2L. Okay, the role of the endocrine system. So the human body represents a complex system with several organs that maintain physiological variables within very narrow limits. So the overall purpose of the endocrine system is to maintain this concept called homeostasis. What is homeostasis? Maybe you've had another class where you've heard that term. Homeostasis. Balance, sustain, I like those two words. constancy of the internal environment. So things like body temperature, blood glucose, blood oxygen content, blood pressure, all of these life-sustaining type functions are kept within very narrow limits and kept constant. So communication is really, really important. We have to have a means of communication between tissues that make up different organs. The nervous system and endocrine system work together to maintain this constancy. So this chapter is specifically going to focus on the endocrine system. The endocrine system is a little bit slower than the nervous system. So we call it a more permissive type system, whereas the nervous system is more fast acting in its responses. So the endocrine system defined refers to the various endocrine organs or glands throughout the body that communicate with other tissues through the secretion of hormones. So hormones are the means by which our body maintains homeostasis. Hormones are chemical messengers, and they travel through the blood to their target tissue to cause a response to maintain homeostasis. Okay, the way that the hormone carries out its response is by binding to a receptor on the target cell. So muscle cells have receptors. And so in response to hormones like testosterone, muscle cells will increase protein synthesis. So muscle cells will grow larger in response to hormones like testosterone. So the receptor is really important because a cell won't respond unless it can bind to its receptor. Okay. So the process of hypertrophy, an increase in muscle size, depends on the balance of two things: protein synthesis and protein degradation. What's a synonym for degradation? What does that word mean? Breakdown. So the balance of synthesis and breakdown. So in order for a muscle cell to grow larger, the balance has to tip towards synthesis. Because if synthesis and breakdown are the same, then there's no change. So in response to weight training, our bodies and muscles remodel themselves. So if you're going to remodel a room in your house, what's the first thing you have to do? You tear it up, right? So to a certain degree, that's what workouts do to our muscles. They induce just a little bit of trauma, micro trauma. We tear up our muscles, so to speak. And that's why in the days following the workout, we have some muscle soreness, don't we? A lot of the time. Because if we're breaking down our muscles, that's going to produce an inflammatory response that results in some soreness. But what happens over the next succeeding days? The soreness subsides as your muscles remodel and rebuild themselves. So hopefully, the objective is that muscles will continually rebuild themselves so that over time we notice a change in the size of a muscle. So hormonal input and nutrition are really important in this response. So if you're remodeling a room in your house, you can go to Home Depot and you can buy really cheap materials, or you can buy more expensive materials, okay? So the calories, quality of nutrition that you put into your body determines how effectively we can remodel muscle tissue. So the magnitude of that response is connected to nutrition and hormonal input. There are 3 different categories of hormones. And so the category of hormone is based on the chemical structure. So peptide hormones are the most common type of hormone. So these are proteins, amino acids that are connected together. Steroid hormones. These are lipid-based. What does it mean for something to be lipid-based? A lipid-based hormone, what does that mean? Yeah, it's made from fat, specifically cholesterol. A lipid-based hormone is made from cholesterol. Cholesterol is a type of lipid that we include with our diet, but our liver can also synthesize cholesterol to make steroid hormones. Amines. Okay. Amines are also made from amino acids. So the 2 categories of hormones that we will discuss the most as part of this chapter include the first 2. So peptide hormones and steroid hormones. So let's start with probably the most discussed steroid hormone, testosterone, lipid-based, okay, made from cholesterol. So because testosterone is a lipid-based hormone, it can easily cross cell membranes. What are cell membranes made from? Testosterone is made from fat. Cell membranes are also made from fat, from lipids, specifically phospholipids. So that's another type of lipid in the body. So because of that, steroid hormone, like testosterone, is easily able to cross a cell membrane to find its receptor in the cytoplasm. So that's where the receptor is for steroid hormones, is inside the cell. Under optimal conditions, okay, for example, with food intake, this will result in increased protein synthesis and hypertrophy. So food intake is really important around the time of a workout. How many have heard that, about that window of opportunity where the food you consume immediately prior and especially immediately post workout is really important? Within 60 minutes following a workout, it appears that our muscles are in this heightened anabolic state, which over time might promote greater amounts of protein synthesis and hypertrophy. Okay, so case in point, let me just explain what all of these graphs are. So this was a study done back in 2017, so not too long ago, looking at the acute testosterone response following a workout that involved squats. Squats are a great total body exercise that tends to elicit very high levels of testosterone. Testosterone, this muscle remodeling hormone. So the testosterone levels were tracked. Prior to the workout, you can see the testosterone levels here. And then immediately post-workout, you can see this spike, and then it progressively, at progressive time intervals following the workout, as you see the testosterone in the blood begin to drop. Now, what made this study so interesting was that in addition to testosterone, they also tracked testosterone receptors. So what they did is they took a biopsy. How many know what a biopsy is? So they took a piece of muscle from the vastus lateralis. So this muscle that was used to do all these squats, they took a piece of that muscle at exactly 60 minutes after the workout to check for receptors. So androgen receptors, which are testosterone receptors. So at 60 minutes after the workout, here's your androgen receptors right here. Okay. Now, over here you see the same thing. The difference between this graph and this graph, in this case, after the workout, people had nothing to eat. Nothing to eat after this workout. After this workout, they were given a meal that included, I can't remember carbs and fats, but they were given at least 25 grams of high-quality protein. I think it was a whey protein supplement, 25 grams, which is, in most supplements, that's like a scoop of protein. So this is in a fasting state with no food after the workout. Over here is what we call a fed state. Okay. So comparing this and this, what are some differences you're seeing? What about androgen or testosterone receptors? What are you seeing there? Where are they getting greater receptors in a fast or fed state? In a fed state, yeah. Yeah, so we're comparing this to this. So in a fed state, they're getting an upregulation in testosterone receptors. That's very important because if testosterone doesn't bind to its receptor, then we don't get any increase in protein synthesis. What else are you noticing in terms of at the 60-minute time point, the blood levels of testosterone? What are you noticing there between the fast and the fed state? Okay? So this is in the blood. Right here at the 60-minute time point, testosterone in the blood. Over here in the fed state, 60-minute time point, testosterone in the blood. Why do you suppose that we have higher testosterone here versus over here? Think about the difference in receptors. Where is all of this testosterone going?
In the cells.
In the cells. Exactly right. So testosterone levels are dropping in the blood because testosterone is binding with its receptor inside the cell and upregulating protein synthesis. So it's that protein synthesis that results in hypertrophy. So take-home message. What's the take-home message? Eat after you work out, yes. Within what time interval? An hour. Okay? It's not just the hormone, but what else have you got to have? You got to have that receptor. It's like a lock and key. So if you want to unlock that hypertrophy response, you got to have the lock and the key together. Okay, so peptide hormones. Most hormones fall into the peptide hormone classification. That's an exam question. You'll see it on the study guide. So you want to take note of that. So these are hormones. They consist of 3 or more amino acids bound by peptide bonds. So once secreted, peptide hormones are hydrophilic. What does that word mean, hydrophilic? And this is another one from the study guide.
Water.
Yes. The blood has lots of water. In fact, the blood is about 55% water. Okay. So peptide hormones are able to easily diffuse through the bloodstream to reach their target tissues. So probably the key peptide hormone from this chapter that we'll talk about is growth hormone. Growth hormone. So a lot of people think that growth hormone is a steroid hormone. It's not. It's a peptide hormone. Growth hormone has lots of different effects in addition to muscle growth. So there's lots of different variants. In fact, there's over 100 different variants of growth hormone. These variants have many different physiological effects we'll talk about. So, steroid hormones are all derived from cholesterol. And so, cholesterol is converted in mitochondria to pregnenolone. Pregnenolone. From there, pregnenolone is subsequently converted to all the other steroid hormones. So the steroid hormone that you end up with depends on the enzyme. The enzyme. So for example, cells in the adrenal cortex have the enzyme to convert pregnenolone into cortisol. Okay, whereas cells in the testes have the enzyme to convert pregnenolone into testosterone. If you compare males versus females, which has a higher resting level of testosterone, you think? Males, about 20 to 30% higher. What about growth hormone? Just stay on that one. Resting levels of growth hormone, peptide hormone. Actually, females have a higher resting level of growth hormone. So, do females increase muscle mass to the same degree as males, generally speaking? No, and that has a lot to do with the difference in testosterone concentration. Do females grow muscle? Yes, they do. But a lot of it has to do with the growth hormone pathway versus the testosterone pathway. So there's different avenues to get to the same point. With males, muscle growth is directed more by testosterone. With females, it's directed more by growth hormone. Females do produce some testosterone in the adrenal cortex. I want you to take a look. Now, state initially, I'm not testing you on anything you see up here. What I do want you to understand is how we go from cholesterol all the way to testosterone. So we have lots of different steroid type hormones involved with different functions. So this is cholesterol all the way up here. And then cholesterol can can interact with enzymes in different parts of the cell. So the green is the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. That's where the enzyme is located. But the kind of the salmon color is enzymes in the mitochondria. So to start off with, we have steroid hormones that undergo reactions to become androgens. Androgens, which include lots of different variants. So dehydroepiandrosterone, androstenediol, androstenedione, testosterone is right here, dihydrotestosterone. So you might be wondering where estrogen comes from. Okay, estrogen comes from testosterone and androstenedione. So the enzyme aromatase converts androstenedione and testosterone into these different variations of estrogen. So how can you tell aromatase is an enzyme? How can you tell something is an enzyme? What's the common suffix? ASE. So let me ask you this. What if you're an individual that experiments with anabolic androgenic steroids? And you have lots and lots of testosterone, more than what your receptors can take in. What happens to all that excess testosterone, do you think? Yeah, it's converted to estrogens, which is where you get a lot of those negative side effects for males. Okay, so we can also go in this direction, and we get mineralocorticoids. Mineralocorticoids, such as aldosterone. How many, maybe based on a previous class, know what aldosterone does? Remember the word from 105. So regulates blood pressure, right? Sodium conservation. So if your kidneys are retaining sodium, water follows salt, right? So it helps maintain your blood volume. So if you're losing a lot of water through sweat, your kidneys will secrete aldosterone to allow for conservation of water. So just an example, this is where cortisol is. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid. So the whole point with this is just understanding that cholesterol is the base. And then you go to pregnenolone, and then several reactions later, you get to testosterone. So the key point is it depends on the enzyme, or the enzymes that are present determine which hormone is produced. Okay, so steroid hormones can readily diffuse into a cell because of phospholipid cell membranes. Steroid hormones are hydrophobic. Peptide hormones are hydrophilic. What does hydrophobic mean then? Yeah, so they don't mix well with water. How well do water and oil mix? Not very well. So testosterone is a lipid-based hormone. The blood has lots of water. So steroid hormones, like testosterone, require a carrier, like a taxi. So the carrier protein for testosterone is sex hormone binding globulin, SHBG. Another good test question. So that's the shuttle for testosterone through the blood. So when testosterone is bound to its carrier, it's considered inactive. So as it reaches muscle, it has to be released from the carrier in order to bind with its receptor inside the cell. Okay, so the very last category, and we aren't going to cover much of these in this chapter other than just to state a few examples. The last category of hormones are amines. So these are made from amino acids or amino acid derivatives or variations of amino acids. So the catecholamines, epinephrine and norepinephrine, okay, they come from the adrenal medulla. And they are derived from tyrosine, which is an amino acid. So just a couple of examples. Epinephrine is also sometimes called adrenaline. So what effect does adrenaline or epinephrine have on our heart rate and blood pressure and glucose release? Increases all of those, right? All right, so the hormone receptor interaction is really important, just like a lock and key. Sometimes a receptor can bind with two similar hormones. So testosterone is an androgen. Dihydrotestosterone is an androgen. So both of these hormones can bind to the same receptor to affect protein synthesis. So there's a saturation point with receptors. A few minutes ago, referring to excess amounts of testosterone due to anabolic androgenic steroid use. And this chapter goes into a little bit of detail on that. Eventually, all of the available receptor sites are full. So between C and D, you're not getting any more of a response. So you have a few hormones with several receptors, 25% saturated. In B, 50% saturated. And so you get this gradual increase in response. So this response could be something like muscle growth. Eventually, your receptors are 100% saturated, so any additional amount of hormone produces no further response. So your textbook chapter talks about this in the context of anabolic androgenic steroid use and the practice of cycling and stacking. So let's go with cycling first. What does that mean, cycling, in the context of anabolic androgenic steroid use? What does that mean? Cycling, what do you think it means?
Means you run it for a little while, then you get off of it for a little while.
Yeah. So you have periods of use and then periods of disuse. Okay, so the period of disuse allows an increase in your receptors. The receptors increase their sensitivity, whereas long-term periods of continued use of high dosages reduces receptor sensitivity. Okay, so good. All right, so then let's talk about stacking. So from your textbook, stacking. What does that mean, or what do you think it means?
Multiple androgens at the same time?
Yes, multiple androgens, I like that. Multiple androgens at the same time. Multiple types of androgens or androgen-like chemicals to elicit a response versus just one. You're using different types to maybe extend the sensitivity of those receptors. Now, please don't take this as Dr. Willardson loves anabolic steroids. This is a timely issue, and it's discussed in your textbook, so I think we ought to spend a little bit of time on it, just so you're aware. Okay, so hormone regulation by feedback control. Negative feedback. So most physiological variables in the body are monitored through negative feedback. Negative doesn't necessarily mean a downward response. Negative just means in opposite of the stimulus. So if glucose levels drop, several cells in the body located in the pancreas, in the anterior pituitary, and in the adrenal cortex can sense the drop in glucose. So in response to that, they release hormones that tend to raise glucose levels or keep glucose in the bloodstream. So hormones like glucagon, it comes from the pancreas, epinephrine, adrenal medulla, cortisol, from the adrenal cortex, growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. So the key point is negative feedback is the most common method of regulating hormone levels in the body. So the three key hormones discussed in your textbook that promote protein synthesis: muscle hypertrophy. That's an anabolic effect. So the three from your textbook: testosterone, growth hormone, and insulin-like growth factor. Those are the three key anabolic hormones. The important point is that muscle growth can take place independent of elevations in these hormones. So what we're talking about is how well do these hormones enhance muscle growth? That's the more pertinent question. Muscle growth can take place without these hormones, but muscle growth happens a lot more readily in their presence. So that's the pertinent issue. Okay. So does resistance training increase hormone levels? Remember that slide we just showed with the squat study and the feeding and fasting? Yes, the answer is yes. So lots of research has been done to compare acute hormone response to muscle growth sometime down the road. So studies have compared different types of workout protocols, and then based on the acute hormone response, so if one type of workout protocol was really effective in promoting this hormone response, then maybe they hypothesized that if that type of a workout was carried out over time, you would get a greater response in muscle growth, is the idea. This is a hard question to answer, for sure, because people respond differently. Not everyone has the same hormone response to a given workout. There is some evidence to support it. So the longitudinal studies are lacking, the studies that actually connect this with the long-term response. There's just a few of those studies. So how do these hormones affect hypertrophy? Three different things. The first one is enhanced protein synthesis. Second one is decreased protein breakdown. Third is satellite cell activation. So what are satellite cells? That's another study guide term. Satellite cells, what are they?
Stem cells to really get around the muscle.
Yes, good. So stem cells for skeletal muscle, stem cells for skeletal muscle. So they can donate their nuclei to the muscle cells, so the muscle cells have a greater capacity to produce proteins, to grow larger. So these three mechanisms are influenced by hormones to create muscle growth. So let's get out to the practical realm now. Hypertrophy-oriented training protocols. So if your goal is hypertrophy, what would be considered components of your program to promote this testosterone response? So in theory, this testosterone response is going to be connected with long-term muscle growth. So first thing, large muscle mass movements. Like we talked about at the beginning of class, general movement patterns, squat. I should have put hip hinge there. Press, pulls, and carries. And I think a lot of people that want to increase muscle mass, they do too many movements that are only involving just a tiny amount of muscle. How much muscle are you involving when you do a bicep curl? Not a lot. Okay, so hypertrophy-oriented movements, we need lots of muscle involved. Because that testosterone is moving around your circulation, interacting with receptors all over your body. I have a really interesting study that I'll present later on this concept of the importance of involving large muscle mass. Okay, 2, moderate intensity. 70 to 85% of a 1 rep max. What would be your rep range at that percentage? What are we talking about repetitions per set wise?
8 to 12?
Yeah, 8 to 12-ish. Right in there. High volume. 3 to 6 sets per exercise. We want to get into those high threshold type 2X motor units. It's the type 2X fibers that can really grow. So we have to do something that's heavy and hard and strenuous in order for our brains to allow access to those motor units. Type 2X. Short rest periods between sets. That's kind of an interesting one. Short rest periods between sets. Relatively short. That's not something that I see a lot of people really track. You kind of, practically speaking, you kind of, after a set, you kind of catch your breath. And then when you feel ready, you go into the next set. But maybe we need to think more about how much rest we have between sets. How many have watched people in the gym and they take way too much time between sets? Yeah. Got to check your Instagram. You got to talk to 5 people. Pretty soon it's 10 minutes between sets. And so if you're really serious about it, right, you've got to think about these 4 things. As soon as you catch your breath, okay, get into the next set. Okay, so what levels of hormones in the blood can we expect from a good squat workout? Okay, well, acute elevations of testosterone following resistance training last for about 60 minutes. Okay, so we saw that in the fed versus fasted study. The average peak generally doesn't exceed 650 nanograms per deciliter. And that's for 60 minutes. That's just for 60 minutes. That's a very small amount of time. So then you compare that with the average dose of testosterone replacement therapy. How many know someone or have heard of testosterone replacement therapy? Okay, so sometimes older men or people with different disease conditions will take some testosterone as a medication to restore normal, healthy levels. Okay, so 200 milligrams twice a week of testosterone edentate. Okay, that's a variation of testosterone, which would be considered a very low dose among anabolic androgenic steroid users, leads to a sustained average of 815 nanograms per deciliter. What does that mean to be sustained? Is that just 60 minutes following the workout, or is that all day long? All day long. So you can see we do get our receptors get some exposure following a workout, which some research evidence really supports the importance of this, leading to muscle growth. But when we're taking it as a medication, okay, we get this sustained average that's a lot higher than what we get through just a workout. So furthermore, healthy young males produce 2 to 11 milligrams of testosterone per day. Okay, so that equates roughly to 75 milligrams a week of testosterone. Okay, so consider that this is from your textbook. A recent survey showed that more than 50% of anabolic androgenic steroid users use more than 1,000 milligrams weekly, which is approximately 10 times more than natural testosterone synthesis, and a lot higher than what we get as part of a workout. So no wonder steroids are so effective, as you're getting this sustained elevation several times more than natural production. There's significant health effects associated with that, though. In terms of testosterone and growth hormone, the short-term elevations we get through working out are not anywhere close to what people get when they use anabolic androgenic steroids. Okay? So why is it that these drugs are against the rules in sports? Because they work. They work really, really well. Okay, so to keep an even playing field, we have to restrict their use. Okay, so here's a great study that shows natural testosterone and hormone release can be connected with long-term muscle growth. So it really is important what we do in the weight room to get a muscle growth response, if that's our goal. So this study was done back in 2017, so not too long ago. 26 resistance-trained men randomly assigned to a high-volume group. Okay, so they did 10 to 12 repetition maximum sets with 1 minute rest between sets. Another group was called the high intensity group. They did 3 to 5 repetition maximum sets with 3 minutes rest between sets. So you notice that as the number of repetitions goes up, the rest interval goes down. So in other words, as the weight goes up, really heavy weights, the rest interval between sets goes up to allow more recovery, to restore that force production. Moderate repetitions, lighter weight, less rest between sets. So you're kind of looking at 2 different approaches here. So here's the practical applications. So I want you to just take a moment, look up here, read through the take-home message from the study. Particularly highlighted there in yellow. So the time period for this study was 8 weeks. So which of the anabolic hormones had the greatest effect, or was related the most? Yeah, testosterone. So another key quote from the study that wasn't included in the practical applications: exercise-induced testosterone elevations independent of training programs used in this study seem to be related to muscle growth. What does this mean right here? Independent of training programs used.
Volume, intensity, whatever, doesn't matter.
Yeah, they were both effective. How many of you, thinking about your history of resistance training, have done workouts that looked like this and workouts that looked like that? How many of you within the same session have done this and this? One exercise is more of this, another exercise is more of this approach. When we get to chapter 8, we're going to dissect all of this stuff. But for now, think about it. And so it's a little bit different approaches, but they're both effective in causing testosterone release and muscle growth over 8 weeks. Okay, so do you have any questions? Okay, so what is the assignment for Wednesday?
Watch the video.
Yep.
Answer the question.
Answer the questions, then on Wednesday we'll go ahead and finish up with chapter 6. We'll have that discussion. There's another reading about sprinting and squat performance, and I'll see you then. Thank you.